Okay, ladies and gents, so today we're going to be talking about Chapter 4 and Chapter 5 in this lecture video. So we'll be going through two different topics. One of those is looking at kind of ecology-related things, stuff related to Chapter 3 pretty directly, looking at ecosystems and niches. And then Chapter 5 will be looking at population growth. So for Chapter 4, we're looking at three parts. We're looking at what climate is, we're looking at niches and community interactions, and then we're going to look at this process called succession, again, very quickly. So let's talk about climate. So you guys have probably heard this term quite a bit recently, talking about climate change, talking about how the Earth is like warming up and stuff like that. But people often get climate confused with a couple other terms, so I just wanted to define what climate was. So climate is just defined as the average year-to-year conditions of temperature and precipitation that you have in some particular area for a long period of time. And when I say long period of time, it's more than just a day-to-day change that we're seeing it, or even just within a year, but it's year-to-year conditional changes. So we look at changes in climate over decades, over hundreds of years, thousands of years, and so on, as we try to make a better gauge of understanding the fluctuations that we would see or the patterns we see and how temperatures change and precipitation changes over time. So when we say that we're seeing climate change, we can also see things that are happening on a small scale, or what we call a microclimate. So even within a climate, you have environmental conditions that can happen very differently in a very short range. So like something that is, say, north facing versus something that is south facing is going to get very different amounts of sun, precipitation might be different, even though they're geographically right next to each other. So with climate, you just have to keep in mind that this is something that happens over extremely long periods of time. It's not something that we can expect to see even within our lifetime, but we are noticing that trends are heading towards a particular direction. So with climate, right, climate's going to change due to various different reasons, and climate is influenced by lots of different outside forces. So heat in the atmosphere is going to influence how precipitation and weather is going to go from day to day, but it's also going to influence how it's going to occur over extremely long periods of time. So as the overall temperature of the planet increases, for example, that's going to change the climate across the entire globe, but that's going to take some time for that to be seen. The latitude in which you live, so how close to the North or South Pole you live, can influence your climate. Transportation or of high winds, of heat by high winds and ocean currents, so how we move energy across the globe, so either in the air, within the water, can influence the climate of a particular area. So like, for example, the current that's going up against the east coast of the United States. So the northern part of the east coast still stays relatively warm, even though it's very far north, because we have currents that are bringing hot air and hot energy up through that area to help those places stay warm. The amount of precipitation, the elevation, and the amount of gases and certain types of gases in the atmosphere can all again influence how climate is going to change over time. So the big thing that people confuse between climate and is the definition of weather. And weather is just the day-to-day conditions in the atmosphere. And those can change within minutes, within seconds, right? That's just what's happening every single day. So it's very dynamic, right? Every day is going to be different. Everything with the weather is going to change. Climate, you're looking at the overall pattern from year to year. Like, do you expect June to have a similar temperature? Do you expect it to be a little bit wet or a little bit dry when it comes to April? Okay, so that information is what we're looking for with climate. Weather is just kind of the day-to-day forecast, what we think is going to be happening. Okay, so when we talk about climate change, right, we're talking about what's happening over year and year and year. So like from year to year, everything is getting warmer, right? So like we're seeing higher average temperatures every year, okay, as opposed to it being warmer from one day to the next, and then it's super cold one day, but then it's warm again the next day. That doesn't necessarily indicate climate change, but it indicates that there's a change in the day-to-day weather. Again, when we're comparing year to year, that's when we're looking at climate. So with climate change, this has actually become a very political topic, obviously, right now, and it's something that's going to influence the future outcomes in the world. So it's important for you guys to be thinking about climate change because you're going to be the ones that are going to be dealing with it, even more so directly than my generation. So we've done things, the United States has done many things like the Clean Air Act to try to encourage us to be better stewards for the environment. There was the Paris Accord that was signed. The Paris Accord, well, not signed, but the Paris Accord that was negotiated, that was basically saying that each country will, do their best to try to limit their amount of carbon output, to lower greenhouse gas emissions, and overall improve the environment of the entire planet and slow down this climate change. And the process in which, this is occurring is due to the amount of carbon dioxide and methane that's being put into the atmosphere. So carbon dioxide, methane, they're both byproducts from combustion, from burning fossil fuels, from utilizing coal. All of those things are causing the general temperature of the planet to change and increase from year to year. So it's overall altering the climate from year to year because we're trapping energy into our atmosphere. So you guys have probably heard of the greenhouse effect before. That essentially the atmosphere is acting like a greenhouse. It's trapping and reflecting back heat energy that should be leaving the Earth, but instead is not, because it's being reflected off of these gases and not being allowed to dissipate back out into space. So, with these changes in climate, we need to talk about what's going to possibly happen to different groups of species over time. So, each population of species is going to have a particular area in which it lives and survives. And each individual species does have the ability to cope with that environment. So every species has built into it essentially what we call a tolerance that allows it to deal with the wide variation of ecosystems in which something could live. So tolerance is just essentially the ability to survive and reproduce under a range of conditions. So being able to deal with very low and high temperatures. So we also can think of this as phenotypic plasticity, the fact that the adaptations that a species has when they're expressed is allowing it to survive in a wider range of habitats than this very narrow, endemic, small habitat that a species could live in. So with these habitats, it's just where a species lives, and then everything in that ecosystem is going to be interacting with it. So there are biotic factors, again, all the living things that the species is going to interact with, abiotic factors, all the non-living things that the species is going to act with. And all of those things are going to influence tolerance and the species' ability to survive and reproduce. So every species is going to fill what we call a niche. A niche is just the full range of physical and biological conditions in which an organism lives. And it's the way in which an organism is going to use those conditions to help us to survive. So when we talked about it in class, we talked about how a niche is essentially like a lifestyle that a species will have. It's something that a species will do in order to help it survive and reproduce, right? Take advantage of the environment that it's in. The issue with niches and why we see species start to change and diversify is that within a niche, only really one species can live in that niche. Only one species can take full advantage of all the resources that are available in that particular area. So no two species occupy the same niche at the same time in the same habitat. Because if you have two populations that are existing in the same place at the same time, right, chances are they're going to be competing for the same resources, and one will end up surviving, the other will likely have to switch or become extinct. So no two species can occupy the same exact food source all the time, the same exact habitat all the time, because there's going to be conflict and there's going to be battles essentially for everything. So this leads to us dividing resources amongst different groups. So communities will separate in order to spread out available resources. So if you look at a tree even, you may have like 3 different species that live in that tree, but the birds that live at the top of the tree are different than the ones that live in the middle and the ones at the bottom. Okay, they may all eat the same insect, but they're only taking advantage of each of those different layers of the trees. The other thing about populations we need to think about is how they're actually interacting with their environment, so those biotic factors. And that deals with how species are either moving into an area, leaving an area, or how they're consuming their food. So predation is essentially where an organism is going to be eating some other animal, so it captures and feeds that other animal. Herbivory is when an organism gets its food source from a plant or producer. And then a keystone species is one that can come in and actually cause a dramatic shift in a community. So if you've ever heard of invasive species before, those can actually come in and wipe out native species or things that should live there or did live there before this thing came in. And it can cause drastic shifts because you might be removing a food source, you might be removing a habitat, you might be removing a predator, and you will see dramatic changes in population size over time. So there's other relationships that species can have within a niche in order to help the species survive and reproduce, and those can be symbiosis or symbiotic relationships. So symbiosis is any relationship in which two species can live closely together. Whether or not their relationship together is where they're helping each other or hurting each other, we still call it a symbiosis because they're two groups of species that are living close by. Okay? So with these symbioses, there are different ways that they can show up. One way that it can happen is a mutualism. So a mutualism is a symbiotic relationship in which both species benefit. Okay, so everyone wins in this type of relationship. So the example I have up here is the moray eel. So moray eels will actually harbor a little fish in their mouths, and those little fish will eat parasites and things that are inside of the moray eel. Right, so the moray is benefiting from not having parasites in his mouth, but also the little fish is benefiting because nothing is going to want to come near a moray eel, right? Because that will eat it. So that mutualism is there for each other's protection. Parasitism is when you have an organism's or symbiotic relationship where one organism is living off of another one, so living on it or inside of it. So the example that I have depicted here is an example where you're looking at a fish that's being eaten by hagfish. Hagfish will actually latch onto something and they will grate away and eat at the side and suck the blood out of other organisms. So here we've got hagfish that are eating, that are parasitizing this fish. Other parasites, you can think of bacteria sometimes can be parasites, ticks, fleas, those are all examples of parasites, organisms that live off of another. And then a commensalism. A commensalism is a situation where you have an organism where the relationship is that one organism benefits while the other one isn't really harmed or helped. Okay, so the example that your book gives is of barnacles that live on whales. So these barnacles live on whales. It's great for them because they can find food more easily because the whale's going to be hunting the food for them. They're able to move around, so with reproduction, they're able to spread their sperm and eggs much further into the ocean, and also the nice thing too is there's protection, right? Nothing's going to be coming up to the whale and eating the barnacles off of it. Okay, so those types of symbiotic relationships are important for establishing populations in their niches. So the last thing I want to talk about from chapter 4 is succession. So succession is just a series of gradual changes that a community can experience after disturbance. So if you have a population that's living in a particular area and something drastic happens, so you have like a bottleneck or something that completely removes the species from that environment, you're going to have an available niche for a new species, right? Something is able to come in and take advantage of that new opened up resources, or those new opened up resources. So if you have succession, it can happen in two different ways. One of those ways is with primary succession. Primary succession occurs when an area that you're in has no trace of previous life. So if you have like a brand new island, you have fresh soil, all right, from a volcano, for example, those are examples of primary species. And so a pioneer species is that first species that comes in and lives off of that land. So they are the primary species, the first one to get there. So you'll see certain primary species that are relatively common, like short-lived annuals and things like that, that can move into areas right when they're available and slowly start establishing new populations because of the new resources available. Secondary succession is a little bit different. This happens when you have an area that was only partially destroyed. So usually primary succession, you have an area that's brand new or completely destroyed where all species are removed. The secondary, there are other species around, like something bad happened, like a tornado or something, but now groups are able to move into that partially disturbed area. So you have, like, say, annual plants living in that area, and then over time you get other species coming in and start moving on. So say this land was brand new and these annual plants came in, that would be primary. And then from here on out, it becomes secondary when a population comes in and starts reestablishing itself. Okay. So last thing I want to talk about here is with chapter 5, just again dealing with population. So we've talked about a population before. So I want you guys to write the definition of a population in your notes, right? It is a group of species in the same, or not, it's a group of individuals of the same species in the same place at the same time that are all capable of reproducing. Okay, so that is a population. So with population growth, population size doesn't stay the same. We've learned this when we looked at Hardy-Weinberg, that one of the things that we know that changes a population is the size. So things either move in and out or things don't live forever. So there are three ways in which a population can change in size. One of those ways is with birth and death. So essentially, as the birth rate goes up, population size increases. As the death rate goes up, population size will decrease. So the population size change is going to be just due to individuals that are created or destroyed, right? So individuals that live and are born or don't live and die. The other way a population can change in size is due to things moving in and out. So if individuals immigrate into a population, that means they're moving into. If they emigrate means that they lose or leave. So emigration is when a species will leave a single area and leave that initial population to either go make its own or move on. Okay, immigration is when something moves into a population. So with growth, growth can happen in three different ways. So a population can, or in a couple different ways. With growth, it can be gradual, but it can also be extremely rapid. It just depends on the species and the available resources that are around it. So probably the most common type of growth, the one that you've seen patterns for, is exponential growth. Exponential growth is where you see individuals in a population reproducing at a constant rate. So they're reproducing at a constant rate, and then eventually those population numbers overlap, and then each of those individuals is reproducing, and then slowly you'll see, initially slowly you'll see a very slow growth in the population, and eventually you'll see just this rapid growth all of a sudden because lots of individuals have suddenly reached reproductive age. Logistic growth is a pattern that we see often after exponential growth, where population growth starts to slow and kind of stay consistent. And that's mainly due to when we reach what we call carrying capacity. So Thomas Malthus, that guy, the old white dude that Charles Darwin referenced in his book, was talking about carrying capacity, essentially when all those resources that were available for a species are maxed out and they can no longer grow. Okay, so individual populations, if they reach carrying capacity, that's the number of individuals that a population can support without them all dying. So if we want to draw what this looks like, if we have a graph like this, right, we have a population size that is again very small and a population that is very large. What we'll see with growth is that our small population to begin with, as we go over time, right, so as our population, this million should be time, sorry, to like whatever, 1,000 years, something like that. But what you see as time goes on, the number of individuals should increase. So as time grows, logistically, it's going to grow slowly, but as the number of individuals grow, right, each of those individuals are going to start making babies, and the population is going to grow exponentially. Okay, so it's going to grow very, very rapidly. So with exponential growth can't go on forever, right? You reach a point where you no longer have resources available for these individuals. You reach that carrying capacity. So as your population number reaches, eventually it starts to slow down, right? And it starts to come kind of lay out, and our population has reached what we call logistic growth, right? So, and then at this point, once logistic growth happens is we have to keep our population in and around this carrying capacity. Because with our populations, you'll see this modulation occur because over time, as the carrying capacity is established for the population, what available resources are, if you go above this carrying capacity, you're going to start lowering resources. So if you go above carrying capacity, you'll have fewer resources. Okay, but if the population number decreases, right, the number of resources go up. If the number of resources go up, so can then the number of individuals. So essentially a vicious cycle. So as the number of resources go up, right, the number of individuals go up, and then eventually you'll reestablish a population, right? They'll kind of fluctuate around this min and max around the carrying capacity. So there are limits to population growth. There are times when populations can no longer grow in size, and that's because populations have reached their carrying capacity. They have no other resources available to continue to make new individuals. So these resources and the dependence upon those can be caused by what we call a limiting factor. A limiting factor is basically saying that a population size will decrease because of one of these things, right? It won't stay the same, or it'll stay close to carrying capacity or go in and out and above. So density-dependent factors are factors that are caused by the population size. So growth is often limited by the number of individuals around a population. So if you have, say, competition for resources with another group of species, if you have a predator that's around that's going to be eating you, if you have parasites and disease, which can happen from overcrowding, those things are all dependent upon the number of individuals. So as the number goes up, oftentimes you'll experience these things like famine and uh, other problems like overcrowding. Density independent factors, those are factors where you have individuals who are affected by something that's outside of the population. It's not dependent upon the number of individuals who are present. So this could be due to things like unusual weather patterns, something drastic, a disaster, climate change. Those are all things that can happen to a population that cause independent, non-density dependent or density independent changes to a population. So if you think about human populations, you can think about what kind of things can limit our population growth. So human populations currently are growing at a more exponential rate. Like we have more people are able to breed, and as more people grow, they'll keep making more people because we're going at this constant rate. Eventually, though, humans are going to reach a point where we are going to meet our max. We're going to meet our carrying capacity, which some argue is pretty close. Some people argue that we've already passed it a while ago, but again, we still have yet to see because we have to see that downcline of population growth, and we have not seen that since the 1800s. So human populations are still continuing to grow at this exponential rate. But at some point, we're going to reach these density-dependent factors, right? There's just going to be too many people and not enough resources, which we're seeing in some parts of the world. There's just not enough food, not enough fresh water to go around for the individuals that are in the population. So these limits to growth don't necessarily happen in humans. We haven't seen them. We're kind of an exception to that. But if you look at any population in nature, we're going to see this actually dependence upon population size continuing to show up. So that's it for chapter 4 and 5. So those two chapters, 20 minutes, real fast. So and fill out your notes. If you have questions, let me know, and we can discuss it in class.